Okay, when we are talking specifically about tenders, we have experience on many tenders around the world. We have participated successfully in tenders around the world, in Mexico, in Chile, in South Africa, in Australia. And all of them are a little bit different. All of them serve to different purposes. So I would say that the key thought for regulators when designing a tender is, first of all, what do they want? What are they trying to get with that tender? Do they want very cheap electricity? That's it. Do they want an impact on the region? Do they want to develop a renewable industry that's going to last there for more time? Depending on what they want, the answer on how to do it, of course, is different. But again, there's some things that are important always. I have to insist on the long term, because here again, this is very important. So let's say you're sure that you want 1 gigawatt of energy for your country being renewable. Probably, if you distribute appropriately this 1 gigawatt in time, the way that it's going to develop the country to adapt to the needs of those tenders are going to be more interesting than if you just put it all in one single tender. So let's say you put one tender of 200 megawatts 1 year, and then you give clarity to the investors. You tell them, yes, the first time it's going to be 200, then in 2 years we're going to be doing 500 more, then in 2 years we're going to be... These kind of things is really useful because it helps investors take it seriously, because they know that if maybe they go to the first round but they were not as efficient as they could be, there's going to be a second round and they will take it seriously, they will stay there in the country, and they will work to make it better so that they go to the second. Also, the whole value chain will develop because, of course, imagine you're talking of wind energy. Nobody's going to open a factory just for one tender or for the results of one tender. However, if you see that every 2 years there are more and more and more, it might be the case that it is interesting for the turbine manufacturers to open a factory there and to start producing there. That might be the case. So, long-term vision. What else is important? It's very important that the tender helps the investors mitigating risks. So usually we have experience that those tenders in which there is a sovereign guarantee, Mexico, for example, South Africa, for example, they were very attractive for international investors with a lot of knowledge. So a lot of people were taking part in those tenders, and the tenders were quite successful, and I think that was key. Also, I would say in certain locations, there's a big risk associated with the kind of currency. So in some tenders, the countries have decided to go for dollars or for euros. So if you pay in dollars or in euros, there is one more risk that you're mitigating, and that will probably help you have cheaper energy because it's one less risk that the investor has to take care of, simply like that. What else is good for a tender? I think it's very, very important that the tender is made in a way that you only allow serious players to participate. What do I mean? If you ask for the right preconditions to participate in the tender, serious players with knowledge of what they're doing are going to participate, and once the plants are awarded, they're going to be built, probably on time and on budget. What happens if you don't ask for these preconditions? Sometimes we see massive participation, which on the one hand is good because probably you lower the costs, but on the other hand, we've seen also that in certain tenders, the plants that were awarded were simply never built. And that's a pity. It's a big waste for the country or the region organizing. It's also a big waste for the participants that feel it's maybe not so interesting to participate in these kind of tenders. So I think that's something that you also need to avoid. And by the way, it's not just about the quality of who wins the tender, it's also about what happens once these players have been awarded. In certain tenders, we have seen a tendency to rotate the assets even 2-3 times before they start construction. Again, electricity is key, it's strategic for the countries. So I don't think it's a good idea that you make sure of who is awarded, and then that can change 2, 3, 4 times until you actually go and start construction of the plant. Many times, again, you're not meeting the desired times, or they're even dropping the projects, and those projects never happen, and you have to repeat the tender. So I think it's important to limit that as well. There's also one thing that can be very interesting to contemplate when you're trying to design a tender, which is when you're in charge of the electricity system of a country, you're perfectly aware of where your good resources in terms of renewables are, and also where the demand is. That's not always ideally placed together, and in any case, in most of the cases, there are a lot of options. So sometimes it's very good as well to try and design a tender that allocates the right megawatts in the right region, so you're sure that the system is going to have certain balance. I think a good example of this was the tenders in Mexico, in which the way it was structured was motivating players to develop projects in one or in another region, depending on the characteristics of the region, but also on the characteristics of the tender. One last thing that it's important to take into account when designing a tender is also regulators might have the possibility to increase the local impact of these investments by selecting certain criteria, such as percentage of local content, such as programs that companies need to follow in order to be able to present those tenders. In this case, for example, in South Africa, the REIPP program was quite advanced in these terms, and I think that the local impact it had when the program was working well and meeting the times, it was very positive.